Geopolitics is not a theater of morality. It is a cold calculus of distance, density, and the brutal physics of kinetic energy. For decades, the world operated under a singular assumption. The assumption was that Iran's nuclear infrastructure, buried deep within the granite veins of the Zagros Mountains, was unreachable. The mountains were considered a sovereign shield. They were a geographic insurance policy against American air power. But in the early hours of yesterday, that insurance policy was forcibly canceled. The myth of the invulnerable bunker died. The Joint Task Force did not just destroy machines, they dismantled a decade of strategic leverage. This was not a symbolic strike. It was a total nullification of Iran's nuclear latency. Power, in its purest form, has reasserted itself. The status quo has been shattered by the weight of 30,000-pound penetrators and the precision of invisible wings. We are no longer talking about sanctions. We are no longer talking about diplomacy. We are talking about the reality of a new Middle East, where the deep earth offers no sanctuary from the reach of the hegemon. The crisis did not begin with the first explosion. It began when Tehran crossed the 90% enrichment threshold. In the world of great power realism, 90% is not a number. It is a declaration of war. It is the point where a regional power transitions into a nuclear-armed disruptor. For the United States, allowing this transition would mean the end of American deterrence in the Persian Gulf. It would mean the permanent entrapment of the U.S. Navy in a sea controlled by a nuclear-armed IRGC. The logic was simple. If the centrifuges at Fordo continued to spin, the American security architecture in the region would collapse. Diplomacy had become a stalling tactic. Tehran used the negotiating table to buy time for their engineers. They believed that once the material was weaponized, the cost of an American strike would become too high. They miscalculated the threshold of American tolerance. They underestimated the willingness of a joint task force to execute a high-risk, high-reward decapitation of a nuclear program. The red line was crossed, and the response was calibrated for total erasure. The mission was a masterpiece of logistics and synchronized violence. This was the Joint Task Force in its most lethal form. It began not with a bomb, but with a silent pulse. A massive, coordinated cyber assault neutralized the Iranian integrated air defense system for 120 seconds. The radars at the Natanz and Fordo perimeters saw only ghosts. The S-300 and S-400 batteries, the pride of Iranian territorial defense, became expensive statues. While the Iranian command and control struggled to reboot, the real predators were already in the kill box. Two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flying a non-stop mission from Whiteman Air Force Base arrived over their targets. These are not just planes. They are delivery systems for the GBU, 5.7 massive ordnance penetrator. This is a weapon designed for one purpose, to kill the mountain. Each bomb weighs 15 tons. It is reinforced steel tipped with a fuse that measures deceleration. It does not explode on impact. It bores through layers of rock and reinforced concrete like a hot needle through wax. At Fordo, the mountainside literally buckled. The sensors inside the facility would have recorded a seismic event before the final detonation. The B-2S dropped their payloads in pairs. The first bomb cracks the granite. The second bomb follows the path of the first, plunging deeper into the heart of the enrichment hall. When the warheads finally detonated, the pressure wave had nowhere to go. It traveled through the tunnels, shredding the IR-6 centrifuges and vaporizing the gaseous uranium hexafluoride. In a matter of minutes, $1 billion of high-tech machinery and a decade of scientific labor were reduced to radioactive dust and twisted scrap metal. The strike was surgical, but its impact was tectonic. The JTF did not target the Iranian people. They did not target the regular military. They targeted the very heart of the regime's power projection. They took away the one thing that made Iran untouchable. Tehran's response was immediate and desperate. Logic dictates that when a nation's strategic crown jewel is destroyed, it must lash out or face domestic collapse. Within an hour, the silos in western Iran opened. A barrage of Shahab-3 and Fatah hypersonic missiles was launched toward American bases in Al Udeid and the sovereign territory of Israel. This was the moment of truth for the regional missile defense architecture. The Aegis destroyers in the Persian Gulf and the Patriot batteries in Saudi Arabia formed a multi-layered shield. This was the clash of the two most advanced military doctrines on the planet: Iran's quantity versus America's quality. The sky over the Middle East became a graveyard of burning debris. The Arrow 3 system intercepted the high-altitude threats, while the naval assets neutralized the low-trajectory cruise missiles. The result was a humiliation for Iranian missile technology. Out of over 100 projectiles, only 3 struck their targets, causing minimal damage to an auxiliary runway. The missile sword of the IRGC had been blunted by the shield of the JTF. This brings us to the strategic turning point. For years, Iran relied on the concept of strategic depth. They believed that by burying their assets and using proxies, they could avoid a direct confrontation with the United States. That illusion is now gone. The JTF has proven that there is no depth deep enough to hide from American kinetic reach. The Zagros Mountains are no longer a fortress, they are a tomb. This realization is currently rippling through the capitals of the world. In Moscow, the Kremlin sees its primary regional ally stripped of its most potent leverage. In Beijing, the CCP must now recalculate its energy security, knowing that the American hand on the throat of the Persian Gulf has tightened. The message is clear. The United States is willing to use supreme force to maintain the global nuclear order. The era of gray zone provocations has been met with a black and white military solution. The consequences for the regional balance of power are absolute. Israel, once facing an existential countdown, now has a generation of breathing room. The Arab monarchies, who have long feared a nuclear Iran, are seeing the return of a decisive American protector. But we must not be fooled by the immediate silence. A wounded power is a dangerous power. Iran has lost its nuclear path, which means it will double down on its remaining tools. The Houthis, Hezbollah, and the disruption of maritime choke points. However, these are tools of annoyance, not tools of hegemony. Without the nuclear umbrella, the axis of resistance is just a collection of militants facing a superpower that has regained its appetite for high-intensity conflict. The logistics of the JTF strike prove that the U.S. can project power halfway across the globe, penetrate the most hardened targets on Earth, and defend its allies simultaneously. That is the definition of escalation dominance. We must look at the map to understand what happens next. The center of gravity has shifted. The United States has reestablished the unipolar moment in the Middle East through sheer technical and military superiority. The centrifuges are gone. The bunkers are collapsed. The myth of the mountain is dead. This was not a war of choice. It was a war of necessity for the preservation of the American-led order. As the smoke clears over Fordo, the reality for Tehran is grim. They are a regional power whose primary strategic asset has been vaporized. They are surrounded by adversaries who are now emboldened. The logic of realism tells us that when a state loses its ability to deter, it must either reform or prepare for further dismantling. The Joint Task Force has done its job. The board has been reset. The only question that remains is whether the world is ready for the volatility that comes when a hegemon reminds the planet that it still possesses the keys to the mountain. The strike is over, but the strategic shockwaves are only beginning to be felt. The silence in the Zagros is the loudest sound in the world today. It is the sound of a superpower asserting its will. It is the sound of the new reality. To understand the magnitude of this operation, we must look beyond the explosions. We must look at the invisible architecture of the kill chain. A mission of this scale is not just about two bombers. It is a massive orchestration of global logistics that spans 3 continents and 5 domains of warfare. Before the first GBU, 5-7, left its bay, the United States had already mobilized a celestial and electronic armada. The Joint Task Force utilized a constellation of over 50 satellites to provide real-time, high-definition infrared and synthetic aperture radar coverage. They weren't just looking for movement on the ground. They were monitoring the thermal signatures of the ventilation shafts at Fordo. They were looking for the subtle vibrations of the centrifuges deep underground. This is the level of ISR intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that defines a modern superpower. While the world watched the diplomatic theater in Geneva, the JTF was mapping every centimeter of the Iranian rock. Logistics is the heartbeat of power. For the B-2 Spirits to fly from the American heartland to the Iranian plateau, they required a seamless bridge of tankers. Over the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, KC-46, Pegasus, and KC-135 Stratotankers were positioned in secret orbits. This is the tail of the mission, the thousands of airmen, maintainers, and fuel specialists who ensured that the strike aircraft never had to land until the mission was complete. This capability is unique to the United States. No other nation on Earth can project such concentrated violence at such a distance without relying on regional bases that are vulnerable to Iranian retaliation. By launching from the continental U.S., the JTF neutralized Iran's primary lever of intimidation, the threat to attack the host countries of American forces. You cannot retaliate against a base that is 10,000 miles away. You cannot deter a ghost that vanishes into the Missouri night. But the real story lies in the total failure of the Iranian integrated air defense system. Tehran had spent billions on the S-300 and the newer domestic Bavar 373. These systems were marketed as stealth killers. They were supposed to turn the Iranian sky into a no-go zone. Yet, when the JTF moved, the shield was not just bypassed, it was rendered blind. This was achieved through revolutionary integration of cyber and electronic warfare. The JTF's EA-18G Growlers and specialized cyber warfare units didn't just jam the radars, they injected false data into the Iranian command loop. The Iranian operators saw clear skies on their monitors while the 30-ton bombers were already overhead. This is the digital decapitation. If you control the enemy's perception of reality, you have already won the kinetic battle. The S-300 batteries at Natanz never even fired a shot. They were still searching for a target that had already delivered its payload and was heading home. The destruction of the centrifuges is a study in the physics of perforation. Most people underestimate the difficulty of killing a facility like Fordo. It is carved into a mountain of solid diorite. It is shielded by layers of reinforced concrete and blast doors that can withstand a nuclear near miss. But the GBU 57 MOP is not a conventional bomb. It is a kinetic spear. When it hits the surface at supersonic speeds, its hardened steel casing converts its massive weight into a concentrated point of pressure. It literally flows through the rock. The JTF used a sequential impact tactic. The first bomb creates a crater and a shock wave that fractures the crystalline structure of the granite. The second bomb, dropped milliseconds later, enters that same crater and penetrates 30% deeper. By the time the third and fourth bombs hit, they are detonating inside the enrichment halls themselves. The result is not just fire, it is a pressure cook effect. The centrifugal forces required to spin uranium gas at supersonic speeds are delicate. Even a minor tremor can cause a cascade failure. The JTF didn't just vibrate the mountain, they pulverized the entire subterranean floor. The enrichment program wasn't just paused, the physical space required to conduct it has been collapsed. Now we must analyze the day after logic. In the cold world of realism, the destruction of an enemy's capability creates a power vacuum. Iran's nuclear latency was its primary tool for regional extortion. It was the big stick they used to keep the Gulf monarchies in a state of perpetual anxiety and to force the West to the negotiating table. With that stick broken, the regional balance of power has undergone a violent correction. Israel is the immediate beneficiary. For the first time in 20 years, the Israeli Defense Forces do not have to plan for a preemptive strike on Iran. The Americans have already done it with a level of thoroughness Israel could never achieve. This reduces the immediate risk of a regional Great War, but increases the risk of asymmetric chaos. The IRGC knows it cannot win a conventional battle. It knows its Air Force is a museum, and its Navy is a collection of targets. Therefore, their only move is to activate the proxy web. But here is where the realist perspective reveals a grim truth for Tehran. Proxies are effective only when they are backed by a credible state power. If the Iranian center of gravity is seen as weak and vulnerable, the loyalty of Hezbollah or the Houthis begins to fray. A proxy wants a patron who can provide a nuclear umbrella or at least a credible conventional deterrent. The JTF strike has exposed the Iranian patron as a paper tiger in the face of American high-end technology. This creates a crisis of confidence within the axis of resistance. We are likely to see a period of frantic, small-scale attacks, UAV strikes on tankers, IEDs in Iraq. But these are the spasms of a wounded animal, not the coordinated strategy of a rising hegemon. Let's talk about the escalation ladder. Many critics argued that an American strike would lead to World War III. Realism suggests otherwise. States act based on their survival instinct. If Iran were to launch an all-out war in response to the destruction of its centrifuges, it would be inviting the total destruction of its oil infrastructure and its regular military. The JTF strike was a calibrated escalation. It hit a very specific, high-value target while leaving the rest of the country's economy intact. This sends a message. We took your nuclear program. If you respond too harshly, we will take your oil. If you continue, we will take your regime. This is intra-war deterrence. By holding the rest of Iran's economy hostage, the U.S. forces Tehran to swallow the loss of its nuclear program as the lesser of two evils. It is a brutal, cold calculus, but it is the logic that prevents total war. The global implications are even more profound. In the halls of power in Beijing and Moscow, the JTF operation is being dissected frame by frame. For years, the narrative has been that the United States is a declining power, weary of forever wars and incapable of decisive action. The destruction of the Iranian nuclear program destroys that narrative. It proves that when the U.S. identifies a threat to its core strategic interests, it can execute a mission of unparalleled complexity and violence with zero casualties. For China, this is a sobering lesson regarding Taiwan. If the U.S. can penetrate the most hardened bunkers in Iran, what can it do to the command centers in the Eastern Theater Command? For Russia, it is a reminder that American stealth and EW technology remain decades ahead of anything currently on the battlefield in Ukraine. The unipolar moment hasn't ended. It has simply been recalibrated for the era of great power competition. Logistically, the JTF has now established a permanent threat profile. The assets used in this strike, the B-2S, the MOPs, the cyber tools, are now blooded. They are proven. The U.S. has demonstrated that it can sustain this level of operations indefinitely. The replenishment of the GBU 5-7 stockpile is already underway. The tankers are back in their orbits. The satellites are still watching. This is the endless watch. Iran is now in a position where any attempt to rebuild the centrifuges will be met with another strike, perhaps even more devastating. The sunk cost for Tehran is now astronomical. Do they spend another 20 years and another $100 billion to build a new facility, knowing it can be destroyed in 20 minutes? This is cost imposition strategy at its finest. You make the enemy's primary goal so expensive and so futile that they eventually abandon it. The strategic turn here is the death of strategic depth. In the 20th century, you could hide an army behind a mountain. In the 21st century, the mountain is just a slower medium for a kinetic penetrator. Geography, once a protector of the weak, has become a trap. The very fact that Iran concentrated its program in a few invulnerable spots made it easier for the JTF to decapitate it. Dispersion is the only defense against a superpower, but dispersion is impossible for high-end nuclear enrichment, which requires massive, centralized industrial footprints. Iran was caught in a geographic paradox, and the JTF exploited it perfectly. As we look at the map of the new Middle East, we see a region where the great game has been simplified. The Iranian threat has been reduced from a nuclear one to a conventional one. This allows the United States to shift its focus. The JTF was a pivot. By solving the Iranian nuclear problem through kinetic force, the U.S. has freed up its strategic bandwidth to face the Indo-Pacific. This is the most significant consequence of the strike. It wasn't just about Iran. It was about clearing the board so the United States can face its pacing challenge in the East. Power is finite. By spending a small amount of kinetic capital in the Middle East, the U.S. has preserved its long-term strategic capital for the South China Sea. The aftermath of the JTF strike will be characterized by a cold peace dictated by American terms. Iran will bluster. There will be funerals for martyred engineers. There will be fiery speeches in the Majlis. But in the quiet rooms of the Supreme Leader's compound, the reality is clear. The mountain failed, the missiles failed, the Allies stayed on the sidelines. The United States acted, and the world did not end. It simply changed. The lesson of the Joint Task Force is that in the arena of great powers, there is no substitute for hard power. There is no bunker deep enough to hide from a nation that has the will to use its strength. The centrifuges are silent, the mountain is hollow, and the American hegemon remains the final arbiter of global security. This is not a win for democracy or morality. It is a win for the cold, hard logic of the spear and the shield. The board has been reset. The next move belongs to those who still dare to challenge the reach of the ghost in the sky.